Why is it so satisfying to see two people who initially can't stand each other fall in love? From something like a cop and criminal dynamic to rival mafia families, or even just two co-workers who cannot stand being in the same room. The enemies to lovers trope is addicting. And somehow, no matter the setting, it just works. Hi, welcome back to my YouTube channel and welcome to my personal dimension, the Danny Mansion. Today I want to talk about the enemies to lovers trope, one of my absolute favorite tropes. We'll be looking at what makes a good enemies to lovers story and what doesn't, as well as why we love this trope so much. The enemies to lovers trope is exactly what it sounds like. Enemies becoming lovers. So now that we have that out of the way, there's lots of things that make this trope so interesting. But let's talk about that a bit later. Let's first look at the key things that are needed for a story to be classified as a good enemies to lovers. At its core, the enemies to lovers relies on, number 1, real conflict, number 2, mutual resistance, and number 3, a gradual shift over time. And that first one, real conflict, is probably the most important, although all of them are really important. Because when we talk about enemies, there are actual levels to this shit. I think what we need to do more often is point out that not every enemies to lovers dynamic looks the same. There's a big difference between playful rivalry and genuine dislike or even hate. And before getting into why the trope is so appealing, I want to break down a few of those layers. Because when people say enemies to lovers, they're not always talking about literal enemies. So at the most basic level, you have what's closer to a hate to love trope dynamic. These are characters who don't get along. They annoy each other, they clash, they get on each other's nerves, but there's no real deep-rooted reason behind it. You see this in a lot of office settings, school environments, or general rival dynamics. They're not enemies in any serious sense, they just really don't like each other. So even though I said there's no real deep-rooted reason behind it, the real conflict is still there. Because the tension here comes more from personality clashes than anything else. Think of a person that really annoys you. Something about them just really annoys you. You don't like the way that they talk, the way that they walk, the way that they dress. Oh my gosh, I absolutely failed that. Oh my god, I'm not gonna try to take that again. Think of a person that really annoys you. Whenever they open their mouth, you just roll your eyes. That's what they are to each other, basically. At least in the beginning. Then there's a second layer, where the dislike runs a bit deeper. This is where characters genuinely despise each other, but are forced into situations where they have to interact. Maybe they're working together, maybe they're working in the same industry, maybe they share a goal, but the key difference here is that their conflict is rooted in something more meaningful. They might have completely different values, beliefs, or ways of seeing the world, and that kind of conflict creates a different kind of tension. It's not loud or explosive all the time, it's quieter, more restrained. It's the kind of dislike where you don't want anything to do with that person. You avoid them, you don't acknowledge them, and even hearing their name is enough to shift your mood. And in this kind of dynamic, the romance builds because they're forced to engage with each other. Think of the forced proximity trope. This is where it really shines. And then there's the final level, one that really embodies the word enemies. These characters aren't just annoyed with each other. They are actively working against each other. They want to see each other's downfall. They hurt each other. Sometimes they even want to kill each other. They are at each other's throats at all times. This is the kind of dynamic you'll usually see in fantasy settings, war narratives, or something like mafia storylines, situations where that level of hatred actually makes sense. And because the starting point is so extreme, the shift into romance becomes even more intense. Now, I've seen some people argue that true enemies to lovers can only exist in those kinds of extreme settings. That you need fantasy or violence or some kind of high-stakes world to make it believable. And to that I say, not necessarily true. You just have to use your imagination well to be able to truly execute it in a non-fantasy setting. An easy example already would be the Mafia AU, like I said earlier. You just have to build conflict that feels just as meaningful. Though I personally believe there has to be some form of criminal activity present, but what do you think? And that brings us to the core appeal of the trope. Because regardless of the setting, it all comes down to one thing. Tension. Ooh, the tension! The tension in enemies to lovers is what makes it so addictive. When two characters are constantly clashing, every interaction between them feels charged. Every conversation has weight. Every small moment of understanding feels significant. And that's exactly what keeps us engaged. Because unlike something like insta-love, where the relationship forms quickly, enemies to lovers stretches out that central question. Will they or won't they? And the longer that question lingers, the more invested we become. But not too long, otherwise it can just feel dragged out. The slow burn. Now, slow burn as a concept isn't exclusive to enemies to lovers. You can have a slow burn in friends to lovers, or even stories where the characters clearly like each other from the start. As long as there's some form of obstacle, the tension can exist. But there's something about enemies to lovers that makes that slow burn feel stronger in a way. More intense, or more satisfying. So why is that? A big part of it comes down to contrast. Going from dislike or even hatred to love creates a much sharper emotional shift. And because that shift is so drastic, it feels more powerful. There's also the element of emotional payoff. The more resistance a relationship has to overcome, the more satisfying it is when that resistance finally breaks down. And throughout that process, both the characters and us as the audience are dealing with conflicting emotions. Watching that tension slowly resolve, that push and pull between I hate you and I understand you. And that's what makes it so compelling. There's also something very human about it. Because in real life, first impressions aren't always accurate. People change, perspectives shift, and enemies to lovers taps into that idea. That connection can come from unexpected places. Another huge part of the appeal is character development. Because this trope forces characters to grow. They have to confront their own biases, they have to question their assumptions, and most importantly, they have to learn empathy. They have to start seeing the other person not as an enemy, but as a person. And that transformation is what makes the romance feel earned. It doesn't just happen. It's built. And the deeper the initial conflict, the more intense the enemy aspect is, the more satisfying that growth becomes. That's why people love redemption arcs in these stories. We love seeing characters change. We love seeing them break out of their old ways of thinking. And we especially love seeing that change happen because of their connection with someone they once opposed. And interestingly, even though these stories can be dramatic or even unrealistic, they often feel more real in one specific way. Because the relationship isn't ideal from the start. It's messy, it's flawed, it's not something you're immediately supposed to root for. But as the characters grow, as they begin to understand each other, that's when the audience starts to shift too. That's when we start rooting for them. Because at that point, it's no longer about conflict. It's about choice. Two people who once stood on completely opposite sides, choosing each other anyway. So now that we've glazed everything about the trope and talked about what makes it good, it's time to talk about the times when the trope isn't always done well. Sometimes what's labeled as enemies to lovers is actually just unhealthy behavior. Now stay with me. If the conflict crosses into the harm, the manipulation, or the disrespect, all without growth, emphasis on the without growth, the dynamic can feel uncomfortable rather than compelling. And to add to that, another thing can be when there's a very huge power imbalance between the two characters. It just feels uncomfortable to watch one character be super weak while the other character is super strong and they hate each other. And then all of a sudden, slowly they start to fall in love. I don't know. It just starts to feel more uncomfortable, at least in my opinion. Another issue can be pacing. If the transition from enemies to lovers happens too quickly, it can feel unearned. The tension needs time to build and resolve. Without that progression, the emotional payoff disappears. What else do you think breaks the enemies to lovers story? So now that we've covered all of that, the enemies to lovers trope remains popular because it's incredibly flexible. It can be light and comedic, it can be dramatic and emotional, or even dark and complex. And no matter the setting or tone, it delivers the same core experience: tension, development, and payoff. And that combination is hard to get tired of. But what do you think? Any other reasons why you think we like this trope so much? Perhaps.
Really like enemies to lovers, or do you just like the idea of someone seeing you at your worst and still loving you?
If you've made it this far, I want to thank you so much for watching. This is the second ever video I'm posting to my channel, and if you haven't already, please check out my last video I did in which I discussed one of my other favorite tropes, the obsession trope. I hope to be able to do more things like this, as well as other types of content like reacting to your favorite TV shows, movies, anime, etc., and reviewing them. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, subscribe to stay tuned and drop any suggestions you may have down below. And I'm curious, do you prefer the enemies to lovers or a different trope entirely? Comment your favorite trope down below. I would love to know. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.